The security footage from Sloan Whitmore Medical Center, parking level 2, camera 4, ran for 11 minutes and 43 seconds before Connor Walsh drove away. The timestamp began at 2:13 in the morning. The board of directors watched all 11 minutes and 43 seconds in a conference room on the hospital's 7th floor on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks later, in a silence so complete you could hear the projector's cooling fan running beneath the image. What the footage showed was this: a man in dark blue scrubs standing on the asphalt while a woman in a dark blazer handed a laminated badge to a security officer. The man did not argue. He said something, inaudible. The parking cameras did not have audio, and the woman's posture indicated she had responded. And then the man knelt, not in submission, but because the badge holder had clipped his belt loop and fallen, and he picked it up from the ground. When he stood, he did not look at the woman. He looked at the car parked 10 feet behind him, the silver sedan, where a boy of approximately 7 years old was visible through the rear window, asleep, one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit. Connor Walsh looked at his son through the glass for a long moment. Then he walked to his car, started the engine, and drove away. The woman in the dark blazer walked back through the parking structure entrance. She did not turn around. In the conference room, nobody spoke for a moment after the footage ended. Then a board member named Gerald said quietly, "She didn't turn around." No one answered. There was nothing to add. Connor Walsh had been a nurse for 16 years, an ER nurse for 11, and a night shift ER nurse at Sloan Whitmore Medical for 6. He was one of those nurses that hospital medicine occasionally produced and found difficulty categorizing, but someone whose clinical competence was so precise and whose personal affect was so low-key that management consistently underestimated him until the moment something went wrong, and he was the only person in the room who knew exactly what to do. He worked nights because Noah's school started at 8:15, and he was home by 6 and could take Noah to school and be back in time to sleep from 9 to 3, which gave him 3 hours in the afternoon before pickup. This was not a sustainable schedule in the abstract. It was sustainable for Connor because he had learned, in the 18 months since his wife Karen left, that sustainable and necessary were the same thing, and that what was necessary was making sure Noah's life looked as normal as possible from the inside. Karen's note had been 12 sentences long, which Connor had memorized involuntarily in the way you memorize things that arrived at the exact moment your ability to process them was least functional. She needed to find herself. She loved Noah, but could not be the mother he deserved. She had thought Connor was strong enough to do this without her, and she believed she was right about that. She was sorry. He had been sorry too. He had also been a nurse for 16 years, which meant he had a specific and hard-won relationship with the concept of people in crisis making decisions that damaged everyone around them, and a specific and hard-won relationship with the concept of not taking it personally, and a deeply imperfect and ongoing relationship with actually not taking it personally, which was different from the concept. Noah was 7. He had Karen's eyes and Connor's hands, large for a child, capable looking. He did not talk about his mother often. When he did, he was matter of fact, the way children were when they had processed something into the fabric of their understanding and it no longer required special handling. He sometimes said, "Before Mom left," the way another child might say, "Before we moved to this neighborhood," as a point of temporal reference rather than a wound. Connor was not entirely sure whether this was because Noah was genuinely fine, or because Noah, like his father, had a deep instinct not to put his weight on someone else when he could carry it himself. He watched for signs of the latter. He was probably too close to see them clearly. Noah's stuffed rabbit was named Gerald, for reasons Noah had never explained, and which Connor had stopped asking about because the explanation, when it came, was always unexpected and required follow-up questions he didn't have the energy for at 7 in the morning. Gerald the rabbit went everywhere with Noah. He was a brown rabbit of undistinguished manufacture, missing one button eye, which Noah had resewn himself with blue thread because it was the only thread in the house, and because it was, Noah said, more interesting. The blue eye was, Connor had to admit, more interesting. The night of the incident, Connor had picked up Noah from the after-school program at 3:15, fed him dinner, helped with homework, put him to bed at 8:30, and then sat in the kitchen for 2 hours before his shift started at 11, doing the administrative work that accumulated in his life the way maintenance did in buildings. Continuously, invisibly, reaching a threshold only when you weren't paying attention. He arrived at the hospital at 10:50 and was in the ER by 10:58. Thomas Aldrich's son came in at 1:17. His name was Preston. He was 29 years old and had the specific affect of someone who had spent his entire adult life in an environment where consequences were managed by other people before they reached him. He was not unconscious. He was aggressively drunk and alternately furious and jovial in the way that certain intoxication states produced. He had arrived by rideshare, which suggested someone in his life had made a good decision. Preston himself had made several poor ones in the preceding 4 hours, the evidence of which was distributed across his clothing. He was brought to Bay 3. He refused to stay on the gurney. He grabbed a tray cart. Connor moved to redirect him, using the established protocol for managing non-compliant patients under chemical influence, a stabilizing hold that prevented the patient from injuring himself or staff, using minimal force applied to the upper arms and shoulder. Preston sat down on the gurney. He had a bruise on his upper left arm that was going to be visible by morning. Connor filed the incident report while Preston was still in the bay, because he always filed immediately, because documentation was the practice that most separated good nursing from great nursing. Aldrich was called by a junior staff member who found Preston's contact list in his phone. This was also protocol. Aldrich arrived at 1:53 minutes before his son was cleared for discharge. He spoke to Preston for 4 minutes in the bay. Then he asked to speak to the attending physician, who explained the clinical situation. Then he asked to speak to whoever had manhandled his son, at which point the attending told him, carefully, that the patient had been managed according to protocol. Aldrich called Margaret at 2:05. Margaret Sloan was 40 years old. She had been running Sloan Whitmore Medical for 3 years, inheriting the position from her father, Dr. Henry Sloan, who had built the hospital from a 2-wing regional facility into a 300-bed research and care center, and who had died of a stroke 4 months ago in his own hospital, in a room he had designed. She had not taken leave after her father's death. She had taken 3 days, which was medically inadvisable and institutionally necessary, because the hospital's Q4 budget review was in 10 days, and the cardiac wing's construction bids were due, and there was no one else. She told herself she was fine. Her father's colleagues told themselves the same thing, and were polite enough not to say otherwise to her face. She was not fine. She was managing, which was a thing she was very good at, but it was not the same thing as fine, and the difference was accumulating. When Aldrich called, she was awake. She had been awake since 1:30 working, and she was tired in the way that made everything feel more urgent and less nuanced than it actually was. Aldrich's voice, when he was unhappy, acquired a specific register that she had learned in 3 years of fundraising events and board meetings and the careful cultivation of 30% of the hospital's annual endowment to respond to with decisive action. Decisive action was what Aldrich expected. It was what he donated for. It was the thing he believed distinguished good institutional leadership from complacency. She arrived at the hospital at 2:10. She put on her blazer over her scrubs because Aldrich was in the building, and she had learned not to meet Aldrich in scrubs. She found Connor in the break room, filing his incident report. She had read Aldrich's summary in the elevator, which was 4 sentences and contained exactly 0 clinical detail. She did not review the incident report. She did not ask Connor to explain what had happened. She said, "Mr. Walsh, I'm terminating your employment effective immediately. Patient handling violations. You'll need to surrender your badge to security." Connor looked at her. He said, "I'd like to walk you through the incident documentation. The restraint was protocol. This isn't the time for a review process. With respect, Dr. Sloan, that's exactly what this situation requires," she said. "Your badge, please." She had not intended to do it in the parking lot. She had intended to do it in the break room, quickly, professionally. But Connor had asked, quietly, without argument, whether he could collect his son from the car before surrendering his access, because Noah was asleep in the back seat, and she had said yes, and she had followed him out, because she intended to have the badge in hand before he left the building. And then she was in the parking lot, and it was 2:13 in the morning, and it happened where it happened. She was back inside by 2:20. She told herself she had acted decisively and that the situation would clarify itself in the review process. The situation clarified itself in a way she had not anticipated. Patricia Gould had been a nurse at Sloan Whitmore Medical for 6 years and had worked with Connor for all of them. She was the kind of nurse who inspired the specific devotion of people who have been in a genuine emergency together and know who they can rely on, and Connor was the name that appeared on her personal list without any question. She had watched the parking lot incident from the ambulance bay where she had gone to take a call, and she had watched it from start to finish with the same sick clarity of someone watching a thing happen that they cannot stop in time. She called the nursing union at 8 the following morning. The union's inquiry took 4 days. At the end of 4 days, 3 senior nurses who had been present in the ER during the incident provided documented accounts of the restraint. The incident, report Connor had filed, was reviewed by the union's clinical consultant. The finding was unambiguous. The restraint was textbook protocol. The bruise on Preston Aldrich's arm was within the expected range of outcomes from a correctly applied stabilizing hold. The problem was Thomas Aldrich. Thomas Aldrich was 63 years old and had built his family's wealth in commercial real estate, which he had found satisfying up to approximately the point when his doctor told him his heart was showing signs of strain, at which point he had redirected a significant portion of his energy and income toward the hospital that could, in a practical sense, keep him alive. He was on the fundraising board. He had pledged $17 million toward the hospital's new cardiac wing. The construction contract had been signed. The architect's name was on the building plan. Aldrich's name was going on the wall beside the entrance. Aldrich made it clear to Margaret, in a meeting that lasted 22 minutes, that if Connor's termination was overturned, the pledge was withdrawn. Margaret sat with this for 3 days. She thought about the cardiac wing and the patients who would use it, and the 300 employees whose positions depended on the hospital's financial stability, and the fact that $17 million was not a number she could replace easily or quickly. She allowed the termination to stand pending full review. Connor was picking up shifts at an urgent care clinic 2 miles away. The pay was 20% less. The hours were incompatible with Noah's school schedule, which required him to rearrange the childcare arrangement he had built over 6 months into something different, which Noah navigated with the elastic acceptance of a 7-year-old who had already done one major rearrangement and understood that this was, apparently, a thing families sometimes did. Connor volunteered on Thursday mornings at a free pediatric clinic associated with Sloan Whitmore Medical's community outreach program because he was a nurse and the clinic needed nurses, and not working was not a thing he knew how to do. He brought Noah because Thursday mornings were a school holiday week, and because Noah liked the waiting room's fish tank, and because Noah was the kind of company that made a morning better. Margaret Sloan's grief counselor had an office on the clinic building's 4th floor. Margaret went every Thursday at 10, which she had told no one, because she was the kind of person who considered it important that the people she led not know she was struggling, which was understandable and counterproductive in equal measure. She walked through the pediatric clinic's ground floor on her 3rd Thursday. The waiting room was busy, 8 or 10 children, parents beside them, the particular organized chaos of a room full of people waiting for medical attention. She was walking quickly, as she always walked, and she would have been through the room in 20 seconds except that something made her slow. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, was sitting in a chair with her arms wrapped around herself and her face turned away from the nursing station. She was not crying, but the set of her body said she was very close to it. A nurse was trying to speak to her, gently, correctly, with the specific language that the guidelines recommended. The girl did not move. Then a boy sat down in the chair beside her. 7 years old, a stuffed rabbit under one arm, with the casual confidence of someone who has decided to take a seat and has no particular agenda about what happens next. He said something to the girl. She looked at him sideways. He said something else. He held up the rabbit, whose mismatched blue eye was apparently interesting enough to require comment. The girl's shoulders came down approximately 1 centimeter. The boy said something else. She nodded. 5 minutes later, she walked with the nurse to the examination room, holding the rabbit. Margaret stopped walking. Connor was at the nursing station. He was looking at a chart. He had not seen her. She watched him for a moment, the way he moved, the way he spoke to the parents, the way he checked on the boy without hovering, the gap between the person she had fired at 2:13 in the morning in a parking lot and the person in front of her, the gap that was not. She was beginning to understand, evidence of two different people but of the same person under different conditions, and the conditions that had produced her decision had been terrible ones, and she had made them worse. She walked out through the clinic's side entrance without stopping. She thought about the cardiac wing. She thought about Noah's blue-eyed rabbit. She went home and sat in her kitchen and thought about her father, who had built this hospital, and about what he would have said about Thomas Aldrich's $17 million and the conditions attached. She had a specific memory of her father, when she was 12, explaining to her why the hospital turned down a bequest from a pharmaceutical company that came with restrictions on which drugs they could stock. He had said, "Money with conditions isn't a donation. It's a purchase." She had thought about that many times in her 3 years as CEO. She had not, until now, applied it to this situation. She called her father's oldest friend on the board, a man named Robert, who had been practicing medicine for 40 years and who had known her since she was born. She said, "Robert, I think I've made a very bad decision. I need to tell you about it." The hospital's annual nursing award ceremony was held in the main auditorium. Patricia had filed Connor's nomination in October, before the termination, and the nominations were sealed by the committee, and no one had reviewed the list carefully enough to notice his name in the program until the programs were printed and distributed. When the nominations were called, the HR director, who had received a note from Aldrich's assistant that morning, forwarded through a channel that would later be characterized as inappropriate use of administrative access, was standing at the side of the stage. When Connor's category came up, the director moved to the microphone before the presenter could read the name. Patricia was in the third row. She stood up. She said, "I'd like to read this nomination," the director said. "This isn't. His name is Connor Walsh," Patricia said, loudly, clearly, to the auditorium and the 200 people in it. Ear nurse, 6 years at this hospital. He was terminated 10 days ago for performing a textbook patient restraint correctly, in the presence of 3 nurses who have all documented that his technique was accurate and appropriate. The union inquiry found no violation. His termination was requested by a donor whose son was the patient. The director said, again, "This is not. The nomination was filed before his termination and is valid under the committee's rules." Patricia held the printed nomination sheet in both hands. "His name stays in the program." The auditorium was very quiet. Not the self-conscious quiet of people politely waiting for an awkward moment to pass, but the dense, alert quiet of people who are paying close attention because they have understood that something important is happening, and they do not want to miss it. The HR director left the stage without making a decision, which was itself a decision, and not the one Aldrich had been counting on. Connor came to the hospital the following week to collect a stethoscope he had left in his locker, a specific model, a gift from his father, irreplaceable in the way that objects become irreplaceable when they connect you to a person who is no longer there. Noah was with him because it was a school holiday, and the urgent care clinic's schedule had him off until the afternoon. They came in through the main lobby. The lobby was busy, mid-morning, visiting hours, the usual movement of a hospital's working day. Margaret was coming out of a board meeting, still holding her folder, still in the blazer she wore when she wanted to look certain about things. She saw Connor. She saw Noah beside him, the brown rabbit tucked under his left arm, the blue eye visible from 12 feet away. Noah looked at Margaret with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to smooth his observations into social acceptability. "Are you the one?" Noah said. "Who made my dad stand in the parking lot in the middle of the night?" Margaret looked at the boy for a long moment. "Yes," she said. Noah considered this. He said it was work stuff. It was. "It was also a mistake I made." Noah thought about this. "Are you going to fix it?" "I'm trying to," Margaret said. Noah looked at her with the blue-eyed rabbit under his arm. "Okay," he said, and seemed to mean it, because he was 7 and had already decided he was going to believe people when they said they were trying, and verify later. Margaret went to the security office. She requested the parking lot footage from the night of the termination. She watched all 11 minutes and 43 seconds. She watched herself walk back inside. She did not watch this once. She watched it 4 times. Then she called Robert. She said, "I need an emergency board meeting tomorrow." The board met at 9 in the morning. Thomas Aldrich was in the building. He had been called for a separate matter relating to the cardiac wings construction timeline and was present in the boardroom as an external board member when Margaret began presenting. She laid out the evidence in the order that made its meaning clearest. First, the incident report Connor had filed, the clinical documentation, the union inquiry findings, then the accounts of the 3 nurses who had been present, then the institutional record of Aldrich's call at 2 in the morning and the timeline between that call and the termination notice, then the footage. The boardroom watched the footage in the same silence that the board members who watched it 6 weeks later would recognize as the appropriate response. When it ended, Aldrich said, "This hospital's financial obligations are our obligations," Margaret said, "not yours." She looked at him directly. "You've been using your pledge as leverage over clinical decisions and personnel decisions for 3 weeks. I understand why you did it. Your son was involved and you were angry. That's human. But the pledge is $17 million with conditions attached. My father had a word for that. The cardiac wing, we'll fund it differently." She looked at the board. "I move that Connor Walsh's termination be overturned effective immediately and that his employment record reflect no violation. I further move that Thomas Aldrich's conduct be reviewed by the Ethics Committee per the board's own standards for external member conduct." The vote was 11-2. The 2 were people whose personal relationship with Aldrich was strong enough to override their better judgment, and Margaret noted their names for later. Aldrich stood. "You'll regret this." "Possibly," Margaret said, "but I'll regret it for the right reasons." He left. He held the press conference 2 days later, in the hospital's lobby, the lobby being technically accessible to the public, with 3 reporters and a camera. He spoke about union pressure. He spoke about the danger of medical institutions being controlled by personnel rather than patient welfare. He was articulate, controlled, and entirely convincing to people who had not seen the 11 minutes and 43 seconds of parking lot footage. He had been speaking for 8 minutes when Patricia walked in. She had a printed copy of the union inquiry findings. She read the relevant section aloud. Her voice was level and clear, and not loud. She did not need to be loud, because the lobby was not large and the reporters had turned to face her. One of the reporters said, "Can you clarify the timeline between the donor's call and the termination?" Patricia read the timeline. The reporter looked at Aldrich. "Mr. Aldrich, how do you respond to the 11-minute gap between your call and the termination notice?" Aldrich said something about institutional response times. The lobby's main entrance opened. Connor came in. He had been called by Patricia at 8 that morning. "You should probably be here," and he had arranged for Noah's neighbor to take Noah to school and come directly. He was wearing his own clothes, not scrubs, which made him look different in a way he was not used to. More ordinary, less clinical, a person in the specific way that hospitals sometimes made you forget their employees were. He stood near the lobby's information desk. He did not go to the press. A reporter came to him. He answered 3 questions. He answered them with the same calm he used for everything. Not the performed calm of someone managing their image, but the practiced calm of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that most situations were better handled with the minimum necessary emotional volume. The 3rd question was, "How are you doing?" He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "I'm a nurse. I know what bad looks like. This isn't it. This is fixable." The lobby's service entrance opened. Night shift nurses came in, 8 of them, some still in their scrubs, from a shift that had ended 2 hours ago. They had driven in on their day off because Patricia had sent a message to the night shift group, which had 24 members, and 8 of them had come. They stood at the back of the lobby. They didn't say anything. They were just there. Aldrich looked at the back of the lobby. He looked at Connor. He looked at Patricia with her printed sheet of paper. He collected his coat from the chair where he had draped it, said something to his lawyer, and left through the side door. The lobby settled back into its ordinary hospital noise, the PA system, the elevator bell, a child asking loudly about the vending machine. The reporters conferred. The nurses who had come in on their day off went to the coffee cart by the entrance. Connor went to collect his stethoscope from his locker. His name was back on the badge system. Patricia had texted him about it that morning. He was on the schedule starting Monday. He found his stethoscope in his locker, under his old charge nurse's review folder, in the specific place he always left things he did not want to lose. He hung it around his neck. He stood in the locker room for a moment, empty, quiet, smelling of the particular industrial disinfectant that was the smell of every hospital locker room he had ever been in, and let himself feel, briefly, the specific feeling of having been somewhere bad and come back to somewhere good. Then he got his jacket and went to pick up Noah. On a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after his reinstatement, Margaret came to the pediatric clinic, not for her appointment. That had ended 2 weeks ago, and her grief counselor had said what grief counselors said at the end of the course, that the work continued on your own, that the tools were available, that she should call if she needed to. She had said she would. She was not sure yet whether she would. She came in through the clinic's ground floor entrance. She was not in her blazer. She was wearing the kind of coat that kept you warm instead of the kind that made you look a certain way. Connor was at the nursing station. He looked up. She held out one of the 2 cups she was carrying. He took it. You didn't need to. I know. She looked at the waiting room. 3 children, 2 parents, the fish tank with the plastic diver. Is there something I can do? While I'm here. He looked at the waiting room, then at her. He pointed to a chair in the corner beside the bookshelf, where a stack of picture books lived, and said, "There's a book on the table, the one with the blue cover. If you're staying, I could use someone to read to the kids while we work through the queue." She went to the chair. She picked up the blue book. She looked at the 3 children in the waiting room, who looked back at her, with the practical, neutral assessment of children deciding whether this new adult was worth their attention. She opened the book. "Does anyone want to hear this?" A boy of about 5 moved to the chair beside her immediately, with no hesitation, because he had been sitting in the waiting room for 20 minutes, and any available entertainment was welcome. A girl a year older followed, in the deliberate way of someone who has decided this is worth doing, but is not going to appear eager about it. A 3rd child, the youngest, maybe 4, wandered over and sat on the floor at Margaret's feet and looked up at her. Margaret read. The book was about a bear who was trying to find something he had lost and kept looking in the wrong places, and the children listened with the focused engagement that children brought to stories about characters who were trying very hard and had not yet figured it out. Connor, across the room, was taking vitals for the first patient of the morning. He glanced over once. Margaret was reading, her voice level and clear, one hand resting on the cover, the 4-year-old at her feet, now leaning against her knee with the unconscious trust of a child who has decided someone is safe. She didn't notice Connor looking. She was looking at the book and at the bear who was still searching and thinking about the things you found when you stopped looking in the wrong places. She turned the page. Noah arrived at 10:30. Connor's neighbor had dropped him off after school. He came into the waiting room with Gerald the rabbit and stopped when he saw Margaret. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're reading," he said. "I am." He looked at the children arranged around her. He looked at the book. He came and sat in the remaining chair and took the rabbit from under his arm and set it on his knees. "What part are you on?" he asked. "He just found the wrong thing again," Margaret said. Noah nodded slowly. "He's going to figure it out soon." "How do you know?" He looked at her with his mother's eyes and his father's hands folded in his lap. "Because he keeps trying," Noah said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "That's always how." Margaret looked at the book. Then she turned the page, because there was still more story to go and the children were listening, and the morning was long enough to finish it.